Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to episode number 13 of History for Shut-ins. On today's episode, we will discuss the presidency of George Washington and the important precedents he sets as president. George Washington was always mindful of his legacy and how we would be viewed in future generations. Of course, after winning independence during the Revolution and overseeing the formation of a new government in the Constitutional Convention, Washington thought that he had done plenty. He wanted to go home and live a quiet life, live at Mount Vernon, work his farm. But the people of the U.S. wanted him to lead them. Nobody else was seriously considered for this new office of the presidency. Alexander Hamilton plays a large role in recruiting Washington and lobbying him to be president. The first presidential campaign was really efforts by the citizenry to convince Washington to accept the position. In many of our early presidential elections, it was considered unseemly to campaign personally for the position. If only that were true now. While Washington warmed slightly to the idea of the presidency as letters are rolling into Mount Vernon from U.S. citizens, he says, quote, "I feel very much like a man who is condemned to death when the time of his execution draws nigh," unquote. And this may be why Washington truly was the right man. Remember, after the Revolution, Congress wanted to make him a king, and he said, no, that's not why we fought. So Washington is almost saying some of these same things, or has the same message, in that I'm not the man, I'm not the person who wants this power. As specified by the Constitution, the president was chosen by the Electoral College. In 1788, selecting electors was decided by each state legislature, by public vote in some states, and by legislative selection in others. So it was really kind of a mix. Each state had as many electors as they did senators and congressional representatives. The election took place in only 10 of the states because Rhode Island and North Carolina had yet to ratify the Constitution. Also, New York State didn't choose electors in time. Each elector was given 2 votes to cast. Whoever received the most votes was the president. Whoever received the second most votes, regardless of party, was the vice president. Washington, of course, wins the support of every elector to become the president, and then John Adams, is the runner-up, so he is the vice president. Washington and Adams are both Federalists. They both believe in a strong, centralized federal government. Washington, as president, had to borrow money to relocate to New York because that's where the capital was. That is the center of the United States government at the time. His inauguration was held near Wall Street in April of 1779. Ironically enough, borrowing a custom from British monarchs who by tradition address Parliament when parliamentary sessions open, Washington gave a brief speech. It was the first inaugural address. That's one of the first precedents he sets. At every turn during his presidency, every action that Washington takes, he is completely aware that his conduct as president is going to set the standard for future presidents. The government, the United States government, in particular, the presidency, was in a very primitive state. Washington's performance in the early years is nothing short of brilliant. Although, quite honestly, if you ask people what were Washington's biggest accomplishments as president, people would have a very hard time listing them. He went to one Senate session to receive its advice under the Senate's responsibility of advice and consent about a treaty, but he became annoyed because senators were uncomfortable, understandably, in his presence and would not debate the treaty in front of Washington. Washington left and swore that he, quote, would be damned if he went there again, unquote, ensuring a separation between the executive and legislative branches. No president has done this since Washington, gone when a treaty is being debated. The Departments of State, War, and Treasury were established, along with the Office of Attorney General, each headed by a trusted presidential advisor. These advisors become known as the cabinet. Washington creates this. This is not in the Constitution. Washington based his idea of the cabinet on his idea after the military during the Revolution and his councils of war that he held. There's a new book out now called The Cabinet, which talks about Washington's impact on creating the cabinet, almost like a team of rivals, which was about Lincoln's cabinet, but this is about Washington's. Washington strove for balance ideologically in his appointments. He signed the first Judiciary Act of 1789, which initiated the development of the judicial branch. The Supreme Court is created, headed by one Chief Justice and at the time 5 associate justices. Each justice was chosen by the president and approved by Congress, just as it is today. A network of district courts was established. The First Circuit Court of Appeals, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, all of these courts are set up under Washington, under the Judiciary Act. Congress sent Washington 10 amendments to the Constitution, what we know as the Bill of Rights. The United States had very severe financial problems after the war. There were both domestic and foreign debts. The major issue of how to raise money for the government was a hot debate, to say the least. The Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, laid plans for governmental financing via tariffs and a tax on liquor. Much of this money was earmarked for paying war debts. Hamilton also proposed a national bank to centralize the nation's financial base and urged the new government to assist in developing a manufacturing economy, if you will. Couple of things here. The Federalists, of course, love the idea of a national bank. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, do not like this idea. They think there is too much power in the federal government, so they are really leery about a national bank. As far as setting up a manufacturing economy, the Industrial Revolution starts in about 1789, when plans for textile mills are taken out of Great Britain, smuggled basically, and brought to the United States. Think of where manufacturing centers are first set up in the colonies, really along waterways or ports in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York, in Rhode Island, throughout, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, on and on and on. Most of the North buys into Alexander Hamilton's argument. And the reason he wants a manufacturing base, one, why send our money over to Europe to buy their goods? Two, it will create tax revenues. Of course, if you are a plantation owner in the South, you're saying, why do I need manufacturing? I have slaves. We have the cotton gin. I am making a very good living. I do not need to set up manufacturing. Plus, ironically enough, where is much of Southern cotton going? To textile mills in the North, in Philadelphia, in Boston, in New York. Philadelphia, until World War II, is one of the leading textile centers, not only in the United States, but in the world. Lots of manufacturing. So the South is saying to the North, go ahead, set up manufacturing. We'll give you the raw materials that you need. Of course, in about 70 years, this is going to come back to bite the South in the rear end during the Civil War, because not only is the northern states out manufacturing the South, but as manufacturing centers are set up, when immigrants come to the United States, where do they go? They go to work in these manufacturing centers in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and such. They aren't going so much down south because of the slave labor, and there's a lack. They're not needed there as they are in the North. That's another reason why during the Civil War, the North seems to have endless supplies of men to fight. So really, it's Hamilton, in my very humble opinion, who helps to separate the North from the South and really sets the North up ultimately to win the Civil War, although we're still a good 70 years from that occurring. So, in order for Hamilton's plans to be approved by the Senate and by Congress, there are still a large number of Democratic Republicans in Congress. Hamilton trades his support for the Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson's plan to locate a permanent capital near Virginia from New York. However, in between, a temporary capital is going to be set up in Philadelphia for 10 years. What does Jefferson get for Hamilton's support in basically creating Washington, D.C.? Jefferson says, I will get you the support you need in retiring the war debt. The other issue with the war debt is that some states had already paid their debts. So states that paid their debts, they're saying to Hamilton, why do we have to throw all this debt into one big pot? We already paid our debt. And Hamilton is saying, if New Jersey can't pay their debt, this is no longer 13 colonies. We are one nation. If one state can't pay their debt, it gives the nation a bad name. So we all have to help to assume these debts. By the midpoint of Washington's first term, much of the early cooperation in his cabinet is now suffering, is declining. Washington's administration splits into the two factions that we've talked about, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Again, the Democratic Republicans are headed by Jefferson, the Federalists by Hamilton, by John Adams, by George Washington. Both parties basically agreed on, or disagreed, I should say, on virtually all aspects of domestic and foreign policy. Much of Washington's energies during his presidency are spent mediating these arguments. It's when I've taught this class previously, I've compared Washington almost to a parent, because Jefferson would come in and say, hey, did you hear what Alexander Hamilton's saying about me? And then Jefferson would vent his spleen. And then Hamilton would come in and say, hey, did you hear what Thomas Jefferson is saying about me? And then Hamilton would vent his spleen. More times than not, Washington sided with Hamilton because Hamilton was his closest aide during the Revolutionary War. Also, Washington and Hamilton are Federalists. Washington, at the end of his first term, wants to get the heck out of Dodge and go back to Mount Vernon. However, he realizes that it was not to be, as there are still many crucial issues that are left unresolved. There were ongoing problems. Think about what's going on in the world. You have the French Revolution. So there are problems between the rivalry, or with the rivalry between the French and the British. The French are saying, hey, we helped you during the war, you should help us. And the British are saying, hey, we signed a Treaty of Paris. You can't go with the French. So there's a lot of that happening. In addition, the political schism between the North and the South was so severe that the South is already talking about secession. We're still 60 plus years out from the Civil War. So this is something that goes on, and the South will talk about it several more times between now and when they actually do it after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. Washington's advisors are saying to him, it's too volatile for you to leave. You are the only person who can keep the country together. If you do not run for a second term, you risk surrendering the presidency to somebody lacking your moderation and the will of the people being behind them. Washington wins the election with a unanimous vote. Once again, John Adams is his vice president. Problem that comes up in Washington's second term. There is a tax on whiskey. Production increases dramatically in the 1790s. And these are key elements of Hamilton's fiscal program that we talked about a little bit earlier. In 1794, resistance to the whiskey tax mushrooms in western Pennsylvania with a tax on tax collectors and the formation of several well-armed resistance groups. Washington is alarmed by what is called the Whiskey Rebellion. He sees it as a threat to the existence of the United States and the government. All the way through the Revolutionary War, Congress was terrified of a standing army, and they still are to this point. When these things are happening, these resistance movements and rebellions that are coming up, Congress is quaking in their boots. What happens is Washington, in an extraordinary move to demonstrate the federal government's power and preeminence over the states, he orders militia from several states into Pennsylvania, into western Pennsylvania. The insurrection subsides with little violence, and the resistance movements basically disband. Washington ultimately pardons the men who were convicted of treason in the Whiskey Rebellion. Soon afterwards, there are high-level departures from Washington's cabinet, which really hurt the quality of his administration. Henry Knox, who was the Secretary of War, quits in December of 1794. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, leaves in January of 1795. Jefferson, the Secretary of State, ultimately leaves. Washington, as all this is going on, of course, is thinking, I only have a couple years left in this, my last term. He never seriously considers a third term. He has been in public service for more than 4 decades. He is drained physically, mentally, and financially. Washington was silent on the opinions of the men looking to succeed him as president. By ceding office after 2 terms, he helps to ensure a regular and orderly transfer of executive power. His 2-term limit sets a custom that stands until 1940, when FDR runs for a 3rd term. It's not until, and it shows you the respect that Washington garners. Nobody attempts to run for a 3rd term. Yes, Teddy Roosevelt tries, and it's technically not a 3rd term, as Teddy succeeds an assassinated president and thus doesn't have his own full first term. But after Teddy wins re-election, he says, I will not run for the third term. And then about 6 months later, he thinks, oh my gosh, why did I say that? But the point being, Washington is held in such high esteem. Nobody challenges that third term. Nobody wants to serve a third term or thinks about it seriously until FDR. And of course, with FDR, we've got World War II and the Depression and all these other things. Written with the help of Hamilton and Madison, Washington closes his administration with a thoughtful address. It urged the United States to be a vigilant, righteous people. Washington warns his fellow citizens against partisanship, or what he called the spirit of faction. And he also advises against foreign entanglements. Think about it. And what he's really talking about, which we'll discuss in a little bit, is the French Revolution. A large part of the country, the Democratic Republicans leading the way, are saying we should support the French. They helped us. Washington and the Federalists are saying we can't. We're not strong enough. We don't have the right army, the right navy, and we're up to our ears in debt. So Washington could not prevent the formation of parties. Again, it's the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Nor does his warning against foreign entanglements prevent his successors from engaging in active diplomacy with European nations, often leading to de facto alliances. To this day, in the Senate, every year, Washington's farewell address is read. So we looked at Washington's domestic policies. Let's talk foreign policy now. Washington sets two very critical foreign policy precedents by assuming control of treaty negotiations with a hostile power. The hostile power at this time is the Creek Nation of Native Americans. He then asks, the other precedent, he asks for congressional approval once the negotiations are formalized. In addition, he sends U.S. emissaries overseas for negotiations without legislative approval. In 1789, the French Revolution is like an earthquake. It sends shockwaves around the world. Many in the United States, mindful of French aid during the Revolution, supported returning the favor. At the same time, the British are inciting Native American attacks in the West, hoping to destabilize the United States. The United States' anger in response to these attacks reinforces sentiments for helping the French in the conflict against the British. Washington was against foreign entanglements. As we've talked about, the U.S. was too weak and unstable. His insistence on neutrality in foreign quarrels sets a key precedent, as does his insistence to make such decisions lodged with the president. Within days of his second inauguration, France declares war on a host of European nations, including the British. We're talking about Napoleon. Controversy over American involvement in the dispute grows and grows and grows. Jefferson and Hamilton and their factions fought endlessly over the matter. Of course, Jefferson is saying we should support the French. Hamilton is saying absolutely not. We don't support anybody in this fight because we can't afford to. The French ambassador to the United States at the time, his name was Edmond Genet, and his nickname was Citizen Edmond Genet. He was appearing nationwide, drumming up support for the French. Washington was less than thrilled, to say the least, by Genet's meddling. When Genet allowed a French-sponsored warship to sail out of Philadelphia directly against orders by Washington not to have the ship sail, Washington demands that the French recall Genet. In mid 1793, the British announced that it would seize any ships trading with France, including ships from the United States. In protest, civil disorder erupts throughout the nation. By 1794, tensions with the British are growing. Washington stops all U.S. overseas shipments. He commissions 6 large warships, among them Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution. An envoy is sent by Washington to Great Britain to reconcile, but the British were now building a fortress in Ohio while they are still pushing insurgent activities elsewhere in the United States. This, by the way, is after the Treaty of Paris has been signed. The British are still here. Washington's response to British provocations was to seek a diplomatic solution. But the envoy to the British, the American envoy, John Jay, negotiates an extremely weak treaty that undermines freedom of trade on the high seas and fails to compensate the United States for slaves taken by the British during the Revolution. John Jay, by the way, is the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Also, the Jay Treaty did not address the common British practice of impressment. So if the British overtake a U.S. ship, they would not only take whatever cargo there was, they would impress or basically enlist those seamen in the British Navy. Imagine if that happened today. Absolutely crazy. Congress approves the Jay Treaty, or they're unsatisfied with it, but they still approve the treaty with the proviso that trade barriers imposed by the British be, wiped out, decreased. Washington, who is also dissatisfied with elements of the treaty, signs it. For the first time, members of the government are openly criticizing Washington. Takes you back to the Conway Cabal and the Newburgh Conspiracy during the Revolutionary War, where people are not happy with Washington because he's not winning enough. While this criticism leads to hard feelings, it also is a major milestone. The fledgling government chose partisan sides, verbally jousted with Washington. Everybody's side was heard. The public got involved, hurling angry rhetoric, and the government remained standing. Freedom of expression, freedom of the press. It was the first example of partisan give and take that's been essential to the survival of the republic and democracy, right? Now, granted, it gets heated at times, but all the way back in Washington's day, there's partisanship. There is one casualty of this. Washington's advisors give him evidence that Edmund Randolph, Jefferson's successor as Secretary of State, allegedly solicited a bribe from a French envoy to oppose the Jay Treaty. Although Randolph denied the charges, Washington forces his friend to resign, and Washington is not happy. With this action, there is another important precedent. The Constitution empowers the president to nominate his principal officers with the advice and consent of the Senate. It says nothing about presidential authority to dismiss appointees. So when an appointee leaves, you do not need congressional approval for that. What do all presidential appointees say? I serve at the pleasure of the president. And that is true to this day. With Washington's dismissal of Randolph, the administrative system of the federal government was once again firmly tied to the presidency. In total, Washington dismisses more than 15 appointees, all without seeking congressional advice. A pair of treaties that are signed. one with Algiers and one with Spain, dominate the later stages of Washington's foreign policy. Pirates from the Barbary Coast of North Africa were seizing U.S. ships left and right. Of course, we really don't have a navy at this time. What are the pirates also doing? Kidnapping crew members and demanding ransom. The pirates forced a harsh treaty on the United States that demanded annual payments to the ruler of Algiers, basically a kickback, a bribe. All this does is it increases Washington's resolve to construct a viable navy. The ships built during his administration would prove to be instrumental in naval actions that ended disputes with Algiers in later administrations. Also, some of these ships are put to use in the War of 1812, which we will talk about when we talk about the presidency of James Monroe. An agreement with Spain had a better outcome for Washington and the United States. Spanish-controlled Florida agreed to stop inciting Native American attacks against colonial, or U.S. I should say now, settlers. Spain also conceded unrestricted access to the Mississippi River, the entire river, to the United States, opening much of the Ohio Valley for settlement and trade, the River Valley, Ohio River Valley, that is. Agricultural produce flows down the Ohio and Cumberland rivers to the Mississippi on their way to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans to Europe. So many of the things that Hamilton has been talking about, let's send goods to Europe, but let's make our own goods here. These things are happening. Jay's treaty with the British continued to have negative ramifications for the remaining time in Washington's administration. France declared it in violation of agreements signed with the United States during the Revolution and claimed it comprised an alliance with Great Britain. By 1796, the French were harassing U.S. ships and threatening sanctions. Diplomacy was highly ineffective. A final precedent set by Washington is also beneficial to society, to the United States. Newspapers sympathetic to the Democratic Republicans, emboldened by the controversy surrounding the Jay Treaty, became highly critical of Washington during his final 2 years in office. To Washington's credit, he did not respond to them publicly. Privately, he is deeply wounded by these attacks on his integrity, and because many of these newspapers are run by Democratic Republicans, who does Washington blame? Thomas Jefferson. And he basically ceases to have contact with Jefferson until he dies in 1799. So we'll finish up by talking about the legacy of Washington. And a lot of it we've talked about, but just to reiterate, among Washington's critics are those who wonder how our nation might have developed had he sided more with Jefferson than Hamilton in partisan debates. By identifying himself with Hamilton, Washington actually grows partisanship that he denounces. This is arguably Washington's biggest failure. In my mind, you're nitpicking, quite frankly. It's true, but if that's the worst thing he does, believe me, we have plenty of other examples from other presidents where you wished that was the worst thing that they had done. Washington, of course, is criticized for owning slaves. He owned them before he was president. He had expressed his desire about abolition, but backed away from initiating it by looking to legislative authority for its conception and execution. So yes, Washington, in our system, laws are created by Congress. So some could say, hey, it's a cop-out for Washington. In a way it is, but that's the way our system works. Congress does not put forth any abolition legislation. So Washington can be for it, but until the legislation is passed and or until Congress approves it and the Senate approves it, Washington, it doesn't matter. He can say he likes it, but if there's no legislation, there's nothing to sign. While Washington provides generously for his slaves after his death in his will, he does not free them until after he dies. In 1798, Washington says, quote, "I foresee that nothing but the rooting out of slavery can perpetuate the existence of our nation," unquote. Very prescient, because again, in about 60 years, we're going to fight a civil war that kills hundreds of thousands of men over the issue of the Union and then slavery. Washington, as I said, establishes precedents that last generations and did more to really put meat on the bone for the presidency than anybody could expect. When John Jay resigned as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, it's Washington who selects his successor from outside of the Supreme Court. He disregards seniority, allowing future presidents to draw from a diverse pool of judicial talent beyond the aging Supreme Court bench. Think about it now. Anytime, our Roberts, who is our current Supreme Court Chief Justice, was nominated as Supreme Court Justice. He was not an Associate Justice first, following Washington's precedent here. When the House of Representatives sought records with regards to the negotiations of the Jay Treaty, Washington refuses to deliver all the documents. He set the precedent for invoking executive privilege. In leading federal troops against the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington presents a clear show of force of federal authority, establishing the principle that the federal law is the supreme law of the land and that the federal government is empowered to levy and collect taxes. We will see this again in the nullification crisis that takes place during Andrew Jackson's presidency, which we will talk about. Although Washington sponsored and supported legislative proposals submitted to Congress for enactment, he carefully avoids trying to dictate or influence judicial and legislative branches. In not vetoing bills with which he disagrees, unless there were constitutional questions, he sets the precedent of executive restraint, which is followed by the next 5 presidents of the United States. By keeping his vice president, John Adams, at arm's length, not inviting him to cabinet meetings, Washington sets the vice presidential role as largely ceremonial. Although Washington hated partisanship and political parties, he tolerated dissent, vicious attacks on his reputation and name, and a divisive press, all in the name of freedom. There is little reason to suggest that Washington, unlike so many of his presidential successors, sought to use the office for his own personal gain. Neither did he shelter his friends for the sake of their friendships when conflicts of interest arose. Washington's presidential restraint, judiciousness, and solemnity created an image of presidential greatness and dignity. He could have been king, but refused, and in doing so, and in setting up the presidency, helps to save the republic. One of my favorite lines about Washington is from his eulogy given by Henry Lee. And the famous line is, "George Washington, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Thank you for joining History for Shut-ins. We will be live again on Tuesday, April 8th at 5 p.m. on Facebook at the History for Shut-ins page. If there are any questions, please leave them for me here and I will answer them. Otherwise, I will see you at 5 p.m. and we will talk about the presidency of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Have a great evening. Take care.